door. An explanation of divestment, I asked what was the official definition of divestment of a couple of financial advisors, and they said there isn't one because divestment started as a grassroots movement. So does divestment include manufacturers of pipeline that are used to carry the oil, or the drivers of the oil trains? 350.org, a global environmental group, defines the top 100 coal companies and the top 100 oil companies as measured by the amount of fuel reserve they have underground. These are the Carbon Underground 200. It's a list that is widely used as reference of the companies doing the most damage. When you look at that list, it isn't Exxon. The big names are China and India companies that I, and probably most of us, have not heard of. The goal of publicized divestment campaigns is not to put companies out of business. A lot of us would have to move all of our money for the companies to begin to say, this is hurting our pocketbook. Naomi Klein, the author of books on environment and capitalism, said that when I sell my Exxon stock, and I feel good about divesting, that someone else will gladly buy it up. An energy policy professor here at RIT agrees. They just poo-poo the idea of a divestment and try and hurt the oil companies. The oil giants know this. 350.org, Bishop Tutu, and others pushing divestment say that divesting is important because of the media attention it puts on fossil fuel companies. The movement wants to publicize that fossil fuel companies are morally unethical. They look bad. They're guilty of physical damage. The movement wants to morally damage the reputation of fossil fuels. I feel good when I divest. Hooray for us. This is the memo that comes attached to the bill. Climate change is real and a serious threat to the health, welfare, and prosperity of all New Yorkers. Maintaining the status quo of fossil fuel energy production will unquestionably lead to a self-created catastrophe. Therefore, the state of New York has a responsibility to take steps to avert this disastrous result. Divesting the New York State Common Retirement Fund from all investments in fossil fuels, as mandated by this legislation, is far from a silver bullet, but it's one important step among many to move our climate away from the precipice. Again, it sounds sort of like a feel-good moment. And because the fund is a large one, supporters of this legislation claim that we will influence other funds to do the same. That's the implied influence. The Office of the State Comptroller has made a significant effort to use significant stockholder engagement to influence the actions of climate-damaging fossil fuel companies, the shareholder advocacy. But these companies have ignored us, ignored entreaties from the office and other institutional investors, and they have played down the threat posed by climate change and scoffed at the possibility of changing their way of doing business. So the comptroller has one view. He wants to keep the advocacy. This bill is saying, no, just get out of it. The text of the bill says the comptroller has fiduciary responsibility. This fund is about wise investments like all other money management. So there's a safety valve that would let the comptroller reverse divestment. Paraphrased, it says, if the value of the fund drops below 99.5% of what it would have been without divestment, then the fund can reinvest in fossil fuels. No feel-good morality there, just financial reasoning. The fund managers see that they are losing money, so it's a good time to get out. The fund lost perhaps as much as $100 million over the last 3 years from coal investments. That's why they want to get out of fossil fuels. Kind of different than the feel-good, make these guys look bad morally. The way that I thought was to make this a positive statement for the state as well as for any of you considering your own investments is to do wise reinvestment. I called the Assemblyman's office to ask why this reinvestment isn't included, but nobody answered. From an environmental point of view, investing in renewable energy is the proper use for money that you take out of fossil fuels. There isn't any legislation pushing for this, perhaps because it's already happening. DiNapoli has allocated $1.5 billion to clean energy investments last year, and he promises to double that for 2016. He also created a low carbon index fund of companies that are working at lowering their emissions. So he said, therefore, we're investing in companies that have to do with energy, but they're much lower emissions than straight somebody mining coal. This fits his idea of advocacy, keeping investments in companies that are doing something with the fossil fuels so that we can push them to do the right things. The legislators pushing this divestment agree with the investment ideas, but they disagree with the idea of shareholder advocacy making a difference. That's what I think this bill is a way to make DiNapoli divest of fossil fuels when he's only wanting to lower the levels. So divestment has a feel-good face, but is actually proposed for a financially sound reason. Maybe that's good enough for all of us.
Thank you, Melissa. And the last bill we're discussing this evening, Barbara will present.
All right, so I'm here to talk about the petroleum storage surety bill. So how many people in this room are familiar with Bakken oil? Do you know what Bakken oil is? Good, okay, so we won't spend time explaining that. So Bakken oil crisscrosses Monroe County every single day, heads to Albany where it gets unloaded and processed, and it's really, really dangerous. Okay, so the worst accident happened in 2013 in July up in Quebec, Lac Mégantic. 47 people died, quarter of the town was burned down. The day afterwards, guess what? The railroad went bankrupt. They declared bankruptcy right away. They could see the claims that would roll in from a disaster of that magnitude. The area that was burned in that fire was equivalent to 50 football fields. I mean, it's just a lot of damage, and there were a lot of damages. So, what this bill is proposing to do is to ensure that although we won't be able to stop Bakken oil because this falls under federal regulation, that we can at least protect New Yorkers financially from the worst financial effects. So what they're doing is proposing to amend a law that already is out there to protect us with shipping and requiring that the same provisions that apply to shipping would apply to rail shipments of oil. So if you want to ship on ships in New York State, you have to post surety in advance. Okay, so that means you have to prove, just like when you get your driver's license and your car insurance, you have to prove that you have a certain level of financial resources so that if you cause a disaster, somebody can come after you. So it's a way of keeping corporations from using the corporate structure to move their assets into places where we can't get them. So this law was written by Assemblywoman Patricia Fahey in Albany. She's got a big stake because Albany is deeply affected more than any other region of New York State by Bakken oil because they have the terminal where it gets unloaded. So it's using all mechanisms that already exist. There is already an office where you can go and prove your financial surety for other things, so it'll just add it on there. It uses a formula that they borrowed from some federal legislation, so that already exists. So it's a relatively simple, straightforward requirement that would be added on to oil shippers in New York State. This bill was presented for the first time in 2014, 2 years ago. It passed the Assembly quickly. it went to the Senate, to the Environmental Conservation Committee, and has never been heard from again. It was reintroduced in 2015. Again, it passed the Assembly quickly. I have the votes here. It was 137-2. So there's no strong opposition to this approach. Republicans and Democrats alike voted in favor of it. But again, it went to the Senate, where it went to the Senate Committee on Environmental Conservation. That again has never been heard from. So I think that this bill sounds like a really reasonable proposition. I've been speaking around town a little bit on this and explained this to various people. Businessmen will explain it back to me. They'll say, oh, this makes perfect sense. You should never hire someone who doesn't have full insurance. You've got to make sure that they have liability insurance. So it seems like it could be a bipartisan approach to protect New York State, and I can't really see any downsides to it, and apparently the Assembly can't either. Now, we might wonder what's going on in the Senate Committee for Environmental Conservation. And I don't have full information on that. I can tell you one of the members of that committee is Senator Funke. He's my senator. And Kathy's been trying to get a meeting with his staff for several weeks, and they haven't gotten back to us on that. So somehow they're like not really eager to hear from us, and we don't really know why that is, because we don't want to project and put words into their mouths. So I think, you know, he needs to hear from people. His office is right there in the blast zone of the Bakken trains. It's hard for me to see this as a partisan issue. I don't begin to understand why someone who sits there in an office in the blast zone would think that it doesn't matter that these Bakken trains are running through there every day. So that's the bill, and Kathy didn't mention it. There were handouts passed out at the registration form, so let me mention that. So they have space. If you found bills tonight that you think sound worth supporting, we invite you to fill these forms out. Probably this crowd looks really savvy. A lot of people don't know who their assemblyman or their senator are, so we left it open, and if you put your address, we're perfectly willing to look up your person and get them to the right people, and actually it'd be really fun to deliver a bunch of them to Senator Funke when his office finally calls us back. So if you feel that you've heard something you'd like to support, feel free to fill that out, and there's a separate one for the CCL, which will go to Carol. So I'm going to shut up so we can have time for some questions.
We'd like to very much thank our panelists. Tonight's program by the League of Women Voters, Rochester metro area, is what we refer to as an educational forum. Our educational forums have different formats. This evening we chose to discuss 4 bills in the New York State Assembly and the New York State Senate that the State League does support. Our programs are not always of this particular nature, but this evening every bill that you have heard mentioned is a bill that the State League is supporting. The State League sets its policies and its legislative agenda through its individual leagues, there are 50 of us in the state of New York, to the State Board of the League of Women Voters. And these bills come under our natural resources policy. So I thought it might be informative before we start questions to give you the policy of the League and why we're supporting these particular bills. The League of Women Voters of the State of New York supports legislation regulations, and executive action to protect our natural resources, public health, and the economy from impacts of the fossil fuel industry, and favors the development of renewable energy to meet emission goals and slow climate change. We believe that the state should support renewable energy, including relevant qualifying criteria for subsidies. The liabilities, costs, expenses associated with fossil fuel operations should be directed to the industry. So that's the framework that we use. We now do have a question period, and this is where they asked me to moderate. Our question period will be over at 8:30. The questions will come from the members of the audience. I would like you to direct them to a particular panelist about the bill that you have a question about. The League, of course, expects the questions to be respectful of our panelists. We also ask that they be concise. That's where I come in. Due to time constraints, the members of the audience will not be given time to make a statement. I've moderated a lot of forums, and I've been known to interrupt if I feel that a member of the audience is taking time away from other members of the audience who have questions for the panelists. So, I'd like to hear the first question.
Barb, does the surety bill cover oil moving on riverways like the Hudson?
Oil moving on the rivers is already covered
Oh,
under.
okay, that's what you were saying,
Yeah.
an add-on? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Mhm.
We've heard about the fate of 7625. Are there positions of our local legislators on any of the other bills? that we
Which-
discussed?
Which panelist would you like to direct that to?
The three panelists other than Barbara.
Okay. We'll start with you, Susan, if we may.
Okay. Do I have to push this button?
No.
Oh, okay. To answer your question simply, I don't know that anyone has taken a position on these bills. For the 100% renewable, I've met with a couple of the senators or their staff and assemblymen in the area. They were gracious to receive me and the information, and they all said they would look into it. None of them have co-sponsored this bill as of yet. We would love to see more people co-sponsor these bills. For 100% renewable, there are, I think, currently 12 or 13 assembly sponsors and only 4 Senate sponsors. So yeah, we would love to see people get on board.
Carol?
I neglected to talk about the New York State carbon fee and dividend bill. And I do want to say, now that you've seen the framework for the federal, New York State is proposing a $35 a ton on carbon, for carbon fee, raising it to 185. And what they're going to do, instead of giving a dividend to people, they're going to give you a tax credit. And they'll only give a tax credit to the poorest and moderately poor people at tax time. And then they'll use the rest of the money to invest in clean energy and modernize infrastructure. The way they state it, they sound like they have support to do that. And this is more of a democratic way of handling carbon fee and dividend. They like to have that extra money to do something with, whereas the Republicans don't want to do that. So at the federal level, we can't really go there, but possibly at the state level, that would be an option.
Carol, the question was, had you had any contact with the Albany delegation from Monroe County in response to the bill that you presented this evening?
No, I haven't.
Melissa?
Oh,
Barbara,
Yeah, I already.
okay, I guess Barbara feels that she answered on the one that, that we are working on. We also have contacted the other senator's office, and that also is a staff person. I'm sure that the people in this audience are appreciative of the timetable. Once we get into March and we're doing the budget, it's very hard to get time face-to-face with our elected officials. The league here locally does our meetings with the elected officials one-on-one starting April 2nd if the budget's been passed, later in April if the budget hasn't been passed. If it's not a budget item at this time of the year, it would be very unusual to have the elected official meet you. But I call the staff so they know who we are, and these 4 bills are on our list that we're calling for the 6 senators in the state of New York, and I will give you a challenge by, let's say, our first primary, April 19th. You do know what Senate district you live in, and we also have 6 assembly members, and if you know your assembly office. And when there is a crunch regarding one of these bills, I will defer to our panelists, but I would think that would be time that your organizations might also put out the word that now's the time to call, now's the time to write letters to the editor, and now it's time to put it in writing, email to your elected officials that can influence these bills. And you want to know, of course, which local assembly members and which local senators are on the committees where the bill is seated, as we call it. The issue that Barbara brought up with the New York State Senate 2 years ago and last year is, and what we as the league have been asking for, is that there be a hearing. There was not even a hearing on the bill, so that the pros and cons of the committee members, who usually are the experts in the Senate that their colleagues look to on such issues, these are very detailed bills. These are what they call getting down in the weeds. So all senators can't be experts on all things. All assembly members can't be an expert on things. So usually those committee hearings are very, very important. I listened to all the budget hearings 3 weeks ago. I know it's hard for people to understand, but the fortunate part about listening to it on television is I don't have to listen to 12 hours at once. I can listen to 2, turn it off for a while, and then go back and listen to another 2. None of these issues were discussed at the budget hearings, which is an executive budget, which, as you know, was amended on Friday. So again, the League of Women Voters, we looked, there was nothing in the governor's amendments on these particular bills. Those are all the process things that you need to know before you go in and meet with your representative.
Barbara Rush, the issue, after the Evan Dawson program interviewing you all, there was a very good assessment by some other experts in the second hour about the climate issue, and particularly talking about climate deniers. And the issue they were saying from one expert was that denial seems to come more from attitudes towards government programs and from beliefs in economics as to what effect addressing climate change will have on economics. These are more...
So your question, sir, your question is to Barbara?
The problem is related to the bill. The bill seems very rational, and it seems like we should support it on a rational basis, but we have heard that in the Senate Environmental Conservation Committee, it's being constantly locked up. And I would suspect there needs to be a way to address these questions of attitudes and economics.
Sir, I'm going to ask you to ask a question, please.
That's the question. How can we do it? How can we address emotional elements?
I can tell you the ideas that I'm working on for how to do it. I would love for all the residents of Fairport Village to sign a statement to Senator Funke and say, "Are you kidding me?" I'd love every congregation to pass a resolution that says, it's your job to protect us, and what are you doing? It has to be a broad-based expression of opinion from a broad-based constituency that Funky thinks he needs some votes for. And probably it needs to happen in some of the other Senate districts as well. But since I live in Funky's district, that's the one I think about a lot.
Regarding that line of thought, now, these trains go on the tracks that CSX owns and the Amtrak uses. So, have you been in touch with them? Are they, because if the tracks, if the trains blow up, their business is affected too. Do you know what side of the fence they're on, whether they support this?
You know, it doesn't really matter.
Excuse me, Barbara. Are you directing that to all the panelists?
To Barbara. She's the one that talked about it, if anybody else has
Yeah.
opinions on it.
Under federal regulation of common carriers law, railroads have to carry stuff that they're offered. They get some protection under regulation and pricing, and they have an obligation to carry freight that they're offered. So it doesn't really matter what CSX likes or doesn't like, they have to take that traffic.
But they can make their voices heard.
Susan, do you have something you want to add?
Wait,
Okay.
she hasn't
Stop
finished.
interrupting.
I'm sorry, Barbara, I didn't hear that you.
No.
Was there another question that I missed?
She's following up.
I just don't think CSX is the player that we need to talk to. I don't see any relevance of them, actually.
Susan?
Really just to support Barb's perspective, we're working on this issue together with Mothers Out Front, and we haven't actively sought out CSX's opinion because I think largely they're under constraints to move the freight. So there's really little they can do about it. There has been some indication that some retired rail workers are opposed to the Bakken oil, but I don't have a way of finding them and locating those individuals.
And they don't make decisions either.
Right.
Carol? Melissa?
It sort of ties in, there isn't any way to get a CSX executive to call Funky's office and say, this is bad business for us too?
You know, that's up to CSX to do, and they probably do talk to Senator Funky in a way that they don't return our phone calls. That's not my business. I'm a citizen and I'm talking to citizens here.
Can I ask you to direct you, so I know which panelist you're asking the question of?
This is for Barbara also. It would be wonderful if we get the oil transportation companies to take financial responsibility for accidents. But do you know if there's any legislation that's going to be proposed to increase the safety?
Yes, I can talk about that. There is federal legislation proposed that would increase the safety in a couple of different ways. One is something about the braking systems of trains. So I guess currently the people who drive the train put the brakes on, and this would like computerize it, just like you've heard of self-driving cars. They would become essentially self-driving trains. That is been required. It's been pushed off a few years at a time for a while, but it seems like it's going to happen. That will probably cut down on derailments. And the other thing, which is in a bill that Schumer is supporting, would, and also I believe Attorney General Schneiderman is supporting, would require them to put a facility out in North Dakota. So before the oil is put on the trains, they would, I think, heat it up and get the vapors to come out of it so that then the vapor pressure is lower, and when derailments occur, they won't explode as explosively as they do now. And those are fine. I'm in favor of them. I mean, I'd rather that they kept it in the ground altogether, but those would definitely increase safety. I haven't heard any prospects that those are going to pass, so I'm not waiting for that. Yeah.
For Barbara, also, what about upgrading the rail cars?
Yeah, so, yes, the rail cars. So I believe there are 3 different types of rail cars that are used for shipping liquids at this point in time. and they're all being used for Bakken oil. Some of them were designed for things like corn syrup, so they're not armored, they're not particularly safe. The strongest ones were designed for shipping crude oil, but not Bakken crude oil. So there was a review of safety, and they did decide that they should stop using the ones that are totally unsafe, and they should only use the safest ones. But I'm not very impressed with this increase in regulation because there's been, I think, 13 different accidents so far, derailments and explosions and big fires. Several of them were the safest cars, and in several cases they were going half of the speed limit. So it doesn't seem anywhere near adequate. And by the way, the Federal Rail Safety Commission, their estimate is that there will be 14 derailments a year in the United States. That's just how many derailments there are, and some of them involve oil trains and some of them don't. Some of them are in urban areas and some of them aren't, but they just assume that we're always going to have them. So, you know, there's a limit to all those safety regulations you could have. They're just not good enough for Bakken oil, as far as I can tell.
I'm going to come back to you for a second question, but if I can get these gentlemen for their first question.
This is my first time I've heard anything about this, but I've been involved in other environmental issues, and I can't direct the question to any one person, but this doesn't sound like this is only a New York State issue. How much does your committee communicate with people in other states to see what strategies that they put into effect that might benefit?
Sorry, Susan, if we could start with you.
Sure. Are you referring specifically to the Bakken trains or just to climate change?
Bakken in general,
Yeah.
and other League of Women Voters, and that things that they've done, strategies that have helped them.
Right. So I think there's a lot happening around climate change across the country. There are many different organizations, and some have agendas like CCL that are strictly federal, and others are trying to move their own state. You know, so we just came today prepared to talk about what our state could do. We represent a fairly substantial percent of the greenhouse gas emissions of the world. Our region of the country, like the northeastern part of the United States, is I think the 7th biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, if you looked at us collectively. We've been involved in a regional greenhouse gas emissions program, which is just for electrical utilities, since 2005, and it has helped to lower emissions a tad. But so there's lots of different things.
Carol?
Well, when I go to a convention, I hear all of the local people talking about what they're doing, like in Minnesota, in Florida. But we're all working on the same federal bill, but a lot of